Okay, so we're diving deep today into some pretty significant stuff that's been happening at the U.S. Department of Education. On the surface, the stuff that went down back in March 2025 might look like, oh, just the usual kind of bureaucratic reshuffling, a bit of budget trimming here and there. But we've been really digging into the details, and, well, honestly, it's starting to look like something a lot more deliberate is going on.
Yeah, it really does.
Like a kind of almost like a coordinated effort to control the narrative.
Exactly. And one of our sources actually uses that exact phrase, narrative control by design, to describe what they're seeing.
Interesting. And what's really concerning when you start putting all the pieces together is how it seems to be targeting the very systems that are supposed to be tracking and addressing these huge inequities we have in our education system, right?
That's exactly it. It's not just about, where the money's not flowing anymore. It's about what information is being actively obscured, almost like they're trying to make it harder to even see the problems in the first place.
Yeah, totally. And that's why we wanted to do this deep dive to really unpack this. So, there are three big areas our source flags as particularly troubling.
Yeah.
The first one is this reduction in oversight happening at the Office of Special Education Programs.
OSEP?
Right, OSEP, which, as I'm sure you know, is the body that's supposed to make sure that states are actually following IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act.
Right.
And then there's the complete elimination of the Office of Educational Technology, which, I mean, come on, that's a whole other can of worms we have to open up. And then finally, these huge layoffs happening over at the National Center for Education Statistics.
NCES.
Yeah. Right, NCES. And what that means for NLEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or what most folks just call the nation's report card, well, it's not looking good.
Not good at all.
I mean, all of these moves individually are worrisome enough, but when you consider them together, like our source is urging us to do, it starts to paint a really disturbing picture.
It really does.
I mean, it's like a deliberate strategy almost to make all of these disparities that affect our most vulnerable students, kids with disabilities, students of color, those from low-income backgrounds, to make those issues less visible, harder to document with good data, and ultimately harder to prove that they even exist in any kind of systemic way.
Yeah, that's the really scary part. Because if you can't see it, can you really even address it?
Exactly. It's like they're trying to sweep it all under the rug. Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit, starting with some historical context, because this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Our source points out that, for a long time, the Democratic Party has really presented itself as this champion of public education. All this talk about equity and opportunity for every child. And they even pull some quotes like Representative Bobby Scott, who has said that education is a civil right.
Right.
And Senator Patty Murray, who was really firm in saying that our nation's future depends on whether we give every child a fair shot.
Yeah, I remember those.
Senator Elizabeth Warren has called public schools the bedrock of our democracy. And Senator Bernie Sanders, he insists that education is a human right, not a privilege. I mean, these are some powerful statements.
They are.
And the source notes how this kind of rhetoric often helps secure support from big education unions, right?
Absolutely.
But then they ask this really crucial question. During times when the Democratic Party has actually had these huge majorities, did they do anything concrete, legislative-wise, to solidify these ideals?
Like put in some really strong protections to safeguard things like IDEA and Title Life funding, or even just ensure that consistent data collection was happening around these equity issues, right?
Right, exactly. And the source's conclusion is pretty blunt.
Oh, yeah.
Not much, at least not enough to prevent what's happening right now.
Wow.
And it kind of makes you wonder, right, if maybe the structure of public education was just left too vulnerable. Maybe unintentionally, maybe not, I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's why it's so open to being weakened when the political winds change.
Right, right. And what the source also points out is this. Where are all those voices now? All those folks who were so vocal before.
Scott, Murray, Warren, Sanders.
Them. Where are they now that all these cuts are actually happening?
Crickets, right.
Pretty much.
And the source, they don't mince words. They say the silence is very telling. It suggests this shift away from what they call the pretense of really deeply caring about these issues.
Oof, that's harsh, but
maybe true.
Maybe.
I mean, it kind of makes those earlier statements ring a little hollow, right? Like, if you really cared that much, wouldn't you be fighting tooth and nail to stop this from happening?
Yeah, you'd think so.
Okay, so let's get into the weeds a bit, starting with OSEP, the Office of Special Education Programs.
Okay.
Our source points to this article in Disability Scoop, I don't know if you saw it, where they detail these big staff reductions at OSEP.
Oh, I did see that, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, these are the very people who are supposed to be monitoring whether states are actually following the rules of IDEA. Making sure that kids with disabilities are getting the services they're legally entitled to. And the article quotes some disability advocates who are just terrified. They're saying that families are going to have almost no recourse if schools fail to provide these services.
Right, and that's a huge problem. But what's even more worrying, and what our source really highlights, is the ripple effect this has. It's not just about fewer interventions when things go wrong. You know, it's about losing this whole system that allows us to see those patterns of noncompliance across different states in the first place.
Right.
Monitoring isn't just about jumping in after the fact. It's about establishing a public record, a paper trail of how IDEA is being implemented or not implemented in different places.
Like those restaurant health inspections,
Exactly. If you don't have regular inspections, you might only hear about problems when someone gets sick, but you won't have that bigger picture of which places are consistently breaking the rules.
Right. That makes sense. And so when we have fewer OSEP staff, what happens? We get fewer of those monitoring reports, right?
Exactly.
And that data that we really need to understand how states are meeting their obligations under IDEA, that gets harder to access, harder to understand, and in some cases, it just stops being collected altogether.
And that's where the real trouble starts because, as our source points out, if no one is actively looking and documenting these violations of IDEA, they don't show up in official reports. They're not in the federal databases. They basically become invisible.
So it's not just about a lack of resources. It's about making the problem itself harder to see.
Exactly. And that makes accountability so much weaker. Families who are already fighting so hard to get the services their kids need, they're facing an even bigger uphill battle now.
Because without that consistent monitoring, that data collection, it becomes almost impossible to demonstrate these larger patterns of neglect.
Right. It's so easy to dismiss each case as just an isolated incident rather than seeing it as part of a bigger problem.
Wow. Our source calls this structural silencing, which is a pretty powerful term.
It is. And it's accurate, too. Because by cutting the funding for oversight, by limiting the availability of this crucial information, the system, whether intentionally or not, makes it harder to prove noncompliance. And in the world of bureaucracy, which you can't see, well, it might as well not exist.
It's like they're trying to make the problem go away by just refusing to acknowledge it.
In a way, yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to NCES, the National Center for Education Statistics, and NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress.
Okay.
Our source mentions this report in K-12 Dive that highlights these big layoffs at NCES, and as a result, NAEP is operating with a skeleton crew. They're calling it bare bones staffing, and there are all these warnings that they're going to have to scale back their analysis, these deep dives they usually do. Now, again, on the surface, this might just sound like some technical adjustments, but our source argues that this is actually attacking the very heart of how we understand equity in education.
I completely agree. NAEP data has been vital for decades in understanding these long-term academic outcomes across different groups. Race, disability, language background, income, where they live. It's been crucial in measuring how big these gaps in educational opportunity actually are, and in making sure that people are held accountable for addressing them.
Right. And by cutting NCES staff and weakening NAEP's ability to do this deep analysis, it's like we're losing our ability to even track these disparities. The problems don't disappear, but they become easier to ignore. We lose that national snapshot of who's being served well by our education system and who's being left behind.
And that, according to our source, is exactly the point. When we stop collecting this detailed data across these different demographics, it becomes much harder to see how things are changing over time, whether policies are working or not, or if they're actually making those gaps even wider.
And if we don't have the data, then there's no public pressure to explain why these gaps exist or to do anything about them.
Right. Our source calls this strategic erasure, which, it's more than just a budget cut. It's actively making the problem of educational inequity less visible and therefore easier to disregard.
The source uses this really powerful analogy here. They say it's the statistical equivalent of shuttering the fire alarm while the building burns and insisting the absence of a siren means everything is fine.
Wow, that's That's a pretty strong image.
It is. By cutting this data collection, it's like the government is blinding itself to the real impact of its policies on different students.
And blinding the public, too.
Right. It's going to be much harder to see those long-term trends, the effects of decisions made over time.
Yeah, that's a big loss.
Okay, now let's talk about the Office of Educational Technology.
Okay.
So this is wild. The source mentions going to their website recently and finding just a blank page, a placeholder.
A placeholder, what do you mean?
Like the whole website, gone. Everything, all the resources, the guidance on digital equity, the discussions about AI in education, technology integration, all of it just wiped clean. It's like the office just vanished.
Wow, that's unsettling. I mean, I remember reading something at Education Week about this, how it means we've lost this national hub for coordinating around digital learning.
Yeah.
But like you're saying, it feels like it goes deeper than that, right?
Oh, for sure. The source argues that the bigger loss here is in terms of these conversations we need to be having about equity in this digital world, things like data privacy, surveillance, and edtech, the frameworks we need to even talk about these issues.
Right, right. Because the Office of EdTech wasn't just about like handing out iPads or making sure everyone has internet. They were really grappling with this complex issue of the digital divide, looking at how new technology could actually make those inequities in our schools even worse.
Exactly. So by getting rid of this whole office, it's not just about streamlining, right? It's about shutting down these crucial conversations about equity in this rapidly changing technological landscape.
It is. All those issues you mentioned, access to digital tools, AI bias in learning platforms, student data privacy, the unequal access to these new learning technologies, all of that is now without a central body to track it, to research it, to even convene discussions about it.
Wow. And without that, it's so much easier for these issues to just slip through the cracks.
Exactly. And those inequities, they'll just keep growing.
It's like they're trying to make the future of educational inequity invisible before it even fully arrives.
That's one way to put it.
And this all leads our source to this pretty major conclusion.
Yeah.
They bring up Naomi Klein's idea of the shock doctrine.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, how they exploit crises or even manufacture them to push through these big changes while everyone is too distracted and overwhelmed to resist.
Right, right.
And they see a clear pattern here. This reduction in oversight, the silencing of this crucial data, the dismantling of this whole infrastructure.
It's like they're following a playbook almost.
Right. And what's so scary is that, we've seen this shock doctrine used internationally for a long time, taking advantage of moments of instability to dismantle public institutions.
Right.
But what's really unsettling, according to our source, is that this is happening here now in our own education system.
Wow. So what are the core elements of this doctrine in this context?
Well, as they describe it, it's about waiting for or even creating this sense of instability and then using that to dismantle these public institutions while people are too busy worrying about other things to really see what's happening.
And they're doing that by weakening protections, defunding oversight, and, this is the big one, erasing all the documentation that can prove that harm is being done.
Exactly. And that's what's so insidious about this whole attack on data that we've been talking about.
Right.
It's not just about controlling the narrative. It's about making sure that there is no narrative to control. Because if you can't measure a problem, you can't prove it exists. And if you can't prove it exists, then no one can be held accountable for fixing it.
It's brilliant in a horrible way.
It is. And here's the really sobering part. No one is coming to save us.
What do you mean?
Our source points out that there's no global education authority that's going to swoop in and stop this from happening. There's no one to sanction the U.S. for doing this to its own students.
So it's up to us.
It is. And the people who are going to be most affected by this, those marginalized communities, kids with disabilities, students of color, those living in poverty, they're the ones who are going to be left with the least protection, the least recourse.
That's the real injustice here.
And the source then gets into this whole issue of the class divide, how these cuts don't really affect the wealthy families in the same way. Their kids mostly go to private schools.
Right.
They don't rely on IDA or Title I funding or NAEP scores.
Their access to quality education is just on a whole other level.
Exactly. They have private consultants, they have connections, they have resources.
And meanwhile, families who rely on the public system are left with what? Paperwork and hope.
Pretty much. And that disparity, that's what's so infuriating.
It is. And it's what they're trying to make even worse. They're entrenching these inequalities by making it harder to even see them.
That's the core concern here. And the author of this piece, the reason they're speaking out, it's not because they think the system was perfect before. It's because they're afraid that without this data, without this oversight, these vulnerable students are just going to disappear from the record.
It's like they're being erased, literally and figuratively.
Exactly. And then, in their conclusion, they come back to this idea of a silent war on public knowledge. They're saying that these cuts are dismantling the very mechanisms that allow us to understand and fight back against injustice in our schools. They're calling them acts of narrative erasure, and they're warning that this is just the beginning.
The beginning of what?
Well, remember the shock doctrine?
Oh, right.
They're saying that we're in that first phase right now, the creation of chaos and confusion, all this news, all these announcements, these closures, this jargon. It's all designed to overwhelm us, to make it hard to focus.
So wear us down so we start paying attention.
Exactly. And then, once that happens, they're going to move on to phase 2, the looting, as they call it.
And what does that look like?
This is where they get really dark. They're talking about a massive restructuring of public education, a handing over of resources and power to private interests.
Privatisation?
Exactly. And they say, we've seen this happen in other countries, with devastating consequences.
That's a pattern.
It is. And they're calling on us to resist this, to be loud, to be persistent, to document everything, to not let them get away with this silent erasure of our public schools.
So what can we do? I mean, it feels so overwhelming.
They say the most important thing is to stay informed, to pay attention, to not get lulled into complacency.
To be the witnesses.
Exactly. And this is where they leave us with this incredibly powerful line. If no one is watching, they can pretend nothing is happening. Our job now is to be the witness and the voice.
Wow. That really sticks with you.
It does. And it makes you think, what is our role in all of this? How can we be those witnesses, those voices that they're talking about?
That's the question we all need to be asking ourselves right now.
I think so, too.